Welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, and in this video we're discussing Monster, the Ed Gein story. Netflix have just dropped their new limited series which builds off the back of the previous two entries. Like Dahmer, Gein's one of the most famous serial killers of all time, and his crimes have influenced several movies and shows. The most notable of these is of course Alfred Hitchcock's seminal Psycho. Gein is known as the grandfather of gore, and he began the public's obsession with these kinds of criminals. Now, while the show touches upon a lot of the major moments in his life, it of course takes some creative license. So throughout this video, I thought we'd look at the real life story and then discuss our thoughts on the series. Monster normally tends to be controversial, and Ryan Murphy's, let's say, choices are hotly debated on social media. So there's a lot to discuss, and with that out of the way, thank you for clicking this. Now let's get into Monster.
Take your time, sweet boy.
Okay, so Edward Gein was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin on the 27th of August 1906. Ed's mother Augusta was extremely religious, and she constantly lectured him and his brother Henry about sin. She said that women were all temptresses that were used by the devil to get men to commit sin. The only woman they could trust was her, and thus Gein became obsessed with his mother. This was one of the most notable influences for Norman Bates, with him also having his mother as the apple of his eye. As for his father, he was quite a pillar of the community. George Philip Gein worked as a carpenter and firefighter, and even owned one of the grocery stores. However, he ended up selling this so the family could move to a 155-acre farm. Behind closed doors, he was an alcoholic who regularly beat Ed and Henry. The farm also meant the kids were isolated from others, and thus Augusta managed to sink her claws in. Though they attended school, this was the only time they really left the farm. Augusta would ban Ed from making friends, and he basically became a bit of an outcast. Having no one around them beyond their parents meant that Henry and Ed only really had each other. Upon leaving school, they began working as handymen for a bit of extra money. Ed would also babysit children, which brings a whole new meaning to the usual question of, would you let this absolute nutcase babysit your kids? Which people often discuss when talking about psychopaths. Ed was apparently great at relating to the kids though, and supposedly he got on with them better than the adults. Now it was around this time that George died due to heart failure at the age of 66. This flipped the dynamics in the home, and finally Ed and Henry outnumbered their parents. Henry ended up dating a woman, and he planned to move in with her. She was a divorced mother of two, and it just made sense for him to step into the father role. This was a time in which divorce was seen as extremely immoral, and it caused some issues with his mother. This further pushed Henry away, but he still worried about his brother. Ed was obsessed with Augusta and refused to abandon her. Henry constantly told him that she was bad news and that he had to escape. Henry clearly hated their mother, which Ed responded to badly. The pair would often argue over her, and eventually this came to a head. During 1944, there was a fire on the farm that ravaged a large part of the property. The fire department arrived and managed to extinguish it, however, something was off. Ed reported Henry missing, and eventually a search party formed on the property. Sadly, they found Henry's body, and this was ruled out as asphyxiation. Due to his father's death, the locals suspected that he also had heart failure, and the police dismissed foul play. Though bruises were witnessed on his head, it was determined that this had indeed been an accident. Some believed Henry had simply fallen and knocked himself out, and that he'd suffocated from the smoke. However, many noted Henry had been dead for some time. As I'm sure you can guess, his death since been ruled as being caused by his brother, but this was only ever suspected in hindsight. And unfortunately, due to no investigation or autopsy being formed, we will never know for certain. Now, all that was left on the farm was Ed and his mother, and he finally became the monster she created. Augusta had a stroke which paralyzed her, and Ed became her full-time carer. Now, Gein later told an interesting story that explained a lot of her worldviews and the ones that she'd instilled in him. The pair visited a neighbor to buy some straw, and they arrived to see him beating his dog to death. A woman from inside the house came out and yelled for him to stop, but the neighbor kept doing it. Augusta was distraught, and she and Ed quickly left. However, upon getting home, Ed said that he was shocked that Augusta wasn't bothered about the dog. What had angered her was that the woman wasn't the neighbor's wife. She referred to her as his harlot and went on a tirade. Augusta died not long after this, and this conversation clearly stuck in his head. In the end though, her death completely destroyed Ed. He'd lost his father, brother and mother and was now completely alone. Gein threw himself into his books and began reading pulp novels. These included subjects like cannibalism, Nazis, and eventually Ilse Koch. In case you don't know, Koch was actually the inspiration for Kate Winslet's character in The Reader. Koch was a concentration camp worker who survivors described as being one of the worst war criminals that ever lived. They said she often used to choose prisoners who had tattoos purely to have them killed and skinned. Their skin would then be turned into lampshades and furniture, and this clearly fascinated Gein. He became transfixed with her, potentially even seeing similarities in his mother. Gein would often continue the odd jobs in town for upkeep, and he slowly boarded up the farm, preferring to live in a small room beside the kitchen. Areas of the house he lived in slowly became run down, whereas he kept all the areas his mother frequented clean and pristine. The government gave him a farm subsidy, and he also sold Henry shares of the land. Slowly, strange disappearances started to rack the town, with this culminating in the disappearance of 58-year-old Bernice Warden. This happened on November 16, 1957, and it would be a day that changed history. Bernice seemingly disappeared from the hardware store she owned, and inside the cash register was found open with bloodstains littering the floor. Her son Frank noted that Gein had been inquiring about antifreeze, and this immediately piqued the cops' interest. The last receipt Bernice had written was for a gallon of antifreeze, and Gein was then arrested and the police raided his farm. What they found was unlike anything they could have expected, and it shocked them to the core. Bernice had been cut up and dressed out like a deer, with her being hung upside down in the shed. Bullet wounds were found as well, indicating she'd been shot and then mutilated. Upon stepping inside the property, what they found was a house of horrors. Skin covered several items of furniture, and skulls were found on bedposts. Beyond that, there was also a corset and leggings made from human skin, along with bowls made from skulls. Bernice's heart was in front of the stove, and noses, nipples, and lips littered several household items and clothing. Gein said that he'd simply been in a dazed out state, which led him to the local graveyard, which is when he dug up bodies and took items from the corpses. The police then checked this story and found that graves had indeed been desecrated. Gein had said he'd done this right after funerals, which explained why he was able to dig them up in the space of a night. Gein said that after his mother's death, he'd been attempting to create a woman's suit so he could become his own mother. He wanted to crawl inside her skin and finally get the attachment that he'd been missing. Now you can see how that also influenced stuff like Psycho and stories like Silence of the Lambs. Though Gein said all those he took from were already dead, there were several deaths linked to him. The first of these was 51-year-old Mary Hogan, who Gein initially admitted to shooting. Her head was found in his home, but he later denied doing it. There was also Georgia Jean Weckler, an 8-year-old who was dropped off at a lane neighbouring the farm after school. Georgia was seen taking the mail from her mailbox, and then she disappeared. A black sedan was spotted near the farm, and Gein owned a black Ford. There was also 14-year-old Evelyn Harley, who disappeared while babysitting. Her father called the residence to no response, and after hearing nothing, arrived to find the house empty. There were lots of Evelyn's clothes scattered around the home, including a broken pair of glasses. Victor Harold Travis was also a 42-year-old hunter who went missing along with his friend Raymond Burgess. The pair went off to shoot deer on the outskirts of Gein's farm, despite him warning them against it. They were never seen again, and Raymond's car disappeared along with them. Gein's neighbour James Walsh also went missing, and Ed would later do odd jobs for Mrs. Walsh after he vanished. That connection has never been concrete, but many have suspected he killed him and tried to step into his role. Sadly, though Gein confessed to a lot of crimes, most of these were inadmissible. Sheriff Art Schley beat him during confession, and thus a lot of what he admitted to was never used in court. Schley blamed the drama of witnessing what he found in the house, and he died shortly before Gein went on trial. It's said that the stress of the house and then having to testify after beating him is what caused Schley to have a heart attack. At said trial, Gein was only arraigned on one count of first-degree murder, which he pled not guilty to. Ed Gein said this was by way of insanity, and then he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Labelled unfit for trial, he was sent to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. He was then moved to Mendota State Hospital. However, 11 years later in 1968, doctors ruled him fit to confer with counsel. His trial began November 7th that year, with it lasting just 1 week. Gein was still up for one charge, but he claimed he hadn't aimed the gun at Bernice. He said it went off by accident and that he didn't remember anything after. After testimony by doctors, he was once more labelled not guilty by reason of insanity. He was once more moved back to Central State Hospital, which is where he spent the rest of his life. As for the house, it was worried it might become a tourist attraction, and thus all his possessions were listed at auction. The land was also valued at $4,700, which was a lot of money for the time. Unfortunately, fortunately, a fire then broke out at the property. Arson was never determined, but the house burned up along with all its secrets. Benice's son Frank was actually the fire chief at the time, and it's thought that he may not have rushed his team to put it out. Because of this, the farm burned down, and when told about it, Gein shrugged and said, "Just as well." His car was then sold to carnival operator Bunny Gibbons, who charged people 25 cents to see it. Gein then died at the age of 77 due to lung cancer and respiratory failure. His gravestone was slowly chipped away at by people seeking souvenirs until it was then stolen in the year 2000. Though it was found the year after, it was placed in lockup, and Gein's grave now remains unmarked. Now, as for my thoughts on the Netflix series, having just rewatched Psycho for a big breakdown we're doing on the channel, I actually saw a lot of similarities. Obviously, they hammer home the idea that was based on Ed Gein, but I think things have come full circle to the point where the movies are now influencing the show. The first word in the series is mother, and even the house interiors have been redesigned to follow the look of the movie. We of course also get a replay of the shower scene and Hitchcock lace throughout, along with Norman Bates as well in some very weird scenes. However, I think the show takes things beyond that, as obviously they don't have the sensors breathing down their back like Hitchcock had. Right from the off, it's pretty crazy, and yeah, the auto asphyxiation scene alone lets you know straight away they aren't holding back. Hunnam is literally all out there and delivering probably his most, out there performance is the only term for it. Now, this can be a bit hit and miss, and I think he does sound like Michael Jackson from time to time. The South Park version. This was to the point I couldn't even understand what he was saying, so subtitles are a must. But overall, I think he hits it more than he misses. And yeah, the extreme scenes go insane. Some very crazy stuff in this show. The touch of the Holocaust that they added in at the beginning, though, I thought was really intriguing, and it hasn't really been brought to the forefront like how it was here. It's been fascinating just learning about his life for this video, and then seeing how it's been interpreted into the show with the comics. Lots of flirting versus sexual harassment stuff along the way. I think, though, it's gonna fall pitfall to a lot of the criticisms around the other series, in that it really relishes the sick and sadistic side of things, and paints that out as being very, very, very sympathetic. Now, personally, I'm really desensitized to this kind of stuff, but I think when you're reviewing something, you have to kind of spell out stuff for people who might not want to go through that. There's always the idea that it's bad to turn evil into entertainment, and I think this is definitely the case here, and some people might struggle with it, especially if you're someone who already hates it. There's also the fact they kind of have to take creative license with what we don't know. So stuff like him killing his brother, that sort of thing, though it's all based around real life, the showrunners have to guess out what was going down. This of course also extends to what's in Ed's mind as well, and obviously they can't get into his head and know what he was fantasizing about. Those stuff that they get at the end gets a bit crazy. Beyond that, we also have them kind of painting Gein out as a sort of Hannibal Lecter type figure who helps track down killers. This includes him naming Ted Bundy, which, from what I can gather, definitely didn't happen. Bundy also apparently never wrote to Richard Speck, and Gein wasn't the unnamed source that led to his capture. I was actually shocked they had him see Bundy get caught, drop his head, get a bright light on him, and then have a vision where his wheelchair goes along the corridor while he's thanked by serial killers who he inspired. Then we have the MTV scene at the end where he's reunited with his mother while the music from The Truman Show plays, and his mother says he's really made a name for the Geins. It's a big swing, mate. I was like, what the hell is this? And I don't think I've shook my head like that for a long, long time. And this isn't gonna help Murphy beat the allegations of glorifying this stuff. Now, I have looked at Gein's past quite a lot, and obviously, it doesn't document every single moment of his life. However, his involvement in the FBI stuff, it seems like they're taking things beyond what really happened. A lot of the stuff in Salem seems like they inserted things rather than taking the facts into play. From what I can gather anyway. Technically, Gein isn't a serial killer either, as he was only convicted for one murder. So I think they wanted to take stuff beyond that and kind of get into the others who might be more interesting. We even had a bit where I thought we were getting that much sought after Mindhunter next season, and they basically bring in dead ringers for the way the real life figures are portrayed in the show. This is to the point they even bring back some of the serial killer actors from that series. Even back at the FBI, it was kind of weird seeing what felt like a Mindhunter episode without any of the original cast. Manson in Mindhunter was also the same actor as the one in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, so maybe we're now getting an MCU, the Mindhunter or Murderer Cinematic Universe. I know it was to highlight how Gein was basically the father of the serial killer, but from what I can gather, he was never interviewed by Robert Ressler. Now, they have of course looked at his cases and profile, but everything was handled by the local authorities in his state. However, new tapes were discovered in 2019 that had County Judge Boyd Clark questioning him. These new recordings likely inspired this, but the last episode is pretty much all made up from what I can gather. What I appreciated at points though was that the series kind of showed Gein's influence beyond his time in the wild. They could have easily just done a life story like what we've done in the video, but they took it beyond that and highlighted how he unfortunately kickstarted the age of the serial killer. Now, that might make it seem like it loses its focus, but I think stuff like Psycho and those that followed are a big part of his twisted legacy. Even if at times I was like, should this be in the TV show on Netflix? The Richard Speck stuff as well kind of feels like it's done as a cameo to make people obsessed with the macabre perk their ears up. Same with Bundy too. It does kind of get a bit gross and overindulgent at times, which I think some might find too much. I did also find the series at odds with itself at points, as talking about how people like Ed need understanding and compassion was then juxtaposed where they show things to be as entertaining as possible, and very comedic it felt. So yeah, it's typical Ryan Murphy that will likely get the typical complaints. It's the creator at his best and also his worst, which I think, yep, will probably prove to be another controversial season. Especially like the last episode with and all the horror villains and just everything in general. The Truman Show music, what the hell are you doing? Whew. Big swing, mate. But yeah, we will be getting Lizzie Borden as the next one, and I'll of course be back to cover that because it doesn't seem like they're gonna stop making them. Anyway, that wraps up the story of Ed Gein, and I'd of course love to hear your thoughts below. What did you think of the Netflix show, and do you feel like it lived up to the monster? Please drop a like on the video as well, and if you want to follow us on Instagram to keep up to date with what we're doing, then make sure you follow us at Heavy Spoilers. Did you know as well that members of the channel also get early access to videos? If you click the join button, you get at least one breakdown a week before anyone else, and it costs just 99 cents a month. Huge thank you to everyone who's done that, and if you want to get some Heavy Spoilers merch that's more on a lighter note, then make sure you check out our t-shirt line located just below the video. All goes towards helping videos like this get made, and yeah, if you want something else to watch, we've got a breakdown on screen right now. We did of course talk about the last series of Monster, so if you're interested in that, go and click it right here. If not, then thank you for watching this. I've been your host Paul, you've been the best, and I'll see you next time. Take care, peace.